I'm with Dr. Rice. You wrote a book called God's Not Dead. I've read it. I love it. It's evidence. But why does this movie have to be made?
Well, I think, my book basically tells the logical story, the evidence for God. If somebody says, well, how do you know God exists? Well, these are the reasons. And the essence is basically that real faith is reasonable. It's not blind. Then they come along and tell a story which basically brings it down into real life. And I think that's what PureFlix has done, and it's a pretty good job.
What I love about your book is that you don't beat around the bush. You say that most atheists, or you say skeptics today, are assaulting Christian kids, assaulting believers. Why do you think they're so angry? What's the deal?
Well, it's a complex question. We have a statement we like to say that insults aren't arguments. And so you'll hear this first line of like, well, belief in God is like belief in Santa Claus or the Tooth Fairy. Well, wait a minute. There's no good evidence for the Tooth Fairy. There is good evidence for God. And once you get past this initial kind of what you called assault or an insult, you'll find that people don't really have a lot of backdrop to that. They haven't really thought it through. So if you can teach a young person or a person of any age to handle that first emotional objection, maybe they'll say something like, hey, there's no evidence for God. Well, would you like to hear some? They'll say, well, evolution says you don't need God. Well, wait a minute, let's talk about it, because evolution really only tries to tell you what happens after you get life. It can't tell you where life came from. And then the ultimate thing against God is evil, is that if there is a God, why is there evil? And yet a very simplistic answer, I shouldn't call it simplistic, but a simple answer is that if there is no God, there is no evil, because you really can't describe the world you can't really describe the world we live in without borrowing the concepts of good and evil, which come from God, which come from the Scripture. So only in a world where there is a God do we know exactly what evil is, because God tells us what it is. He defines it. He tells us don't do it, and then he defeats it. That's really the whole greatness of the cross, is that Christ absorbed the evil of the world. He took it upon himself to break its power. So that's why we call it good news.
I love it. You don't have to turn the television on for too long to have proof about sin and evil in the world. That's for sure. Okay, so I gotta ask. Again, I'm reading the book, and I recommend anybody to pick this book up, whether they get it on Kindle or wherever. But what was happening in your world? What kind of conversations were you having? What kinds of things were you hearing that caused you to have to write that book?
Well, it started with me with my atheist brother. 30 years ago, came home from law school to talk me out of the Christian faith. And long story short, but at the end of that weekend that he came home to talk me out of the faith, we baptized him. And he basically said, I think I've been asking the wrong questions. So that began a process for me to really help answer questions. I think that a lot of people have questions that they're asking, they can't find the answers. And so a few simple reasons. The Scripture tells us to always be ready to give a reason for the hope that's within us. So that's what we're hoping the movie does. We're hoping the book does. So yeah.
You said something in the book that I have to jump on too. It's not just enough to love people, although we should, but you got to have an answer as well. What is the difference between an argument and a conversation?
Well, I think an argument really is a point of contention. I mean, does God exist or not? Well, if you disagree, then you have two things to do. You either abandon it and don't talk to each other, or then you engage in a conversation. So hopefully you have more of a dialogue, and dialogue is really kind of where you're listening to one another.
That's what I was going to ask. Is listening a part of it?
The argument is more of a tennis match where you're really trying to win, and that's the time for that. You see it in political conversation, you see it in debates, and yet there comes a point where people want to see that battle. They want to see which idea is the better idea.
A couple more questions. What is your personal vision? This has got to be an incredible, blessing to you that the movie's been produced.
Sure.
What's the vision from Dr. Rice for this film, and maybe for ongoing curriculum, mobile apps, the conversations that continue? What's the vision from you?
I think pretty simply is that people know that there's evidence for God and they get prepared. Number one, I think for believers to have confidence. Number two, that if you're seeking and you're kind of ambivalent about, or you don't know whether, should I believe or should I not believe? And really, if you think it's no evidence for God, then you'll just abandon it. And then maybe for the skeptic who has completely dismissed God, to say, wait a minute, I may need to reconsider that. So we give believers the confidence, seekers more reason to seek God, and then the absolute skeptic to say, maybe I need to reconsider this.
One last question. It's a simple one, although I don't want a one-word answer. Is God dead?
Oh, of course not. As one man said, I spoke to him today. You know. No, thank you.
That's
we
excellent.
Appreciate that. We appreciate you being here and all that is going on to make this thing possible.
Thank you for doing what you've done. So thank you.